thoughts about overpopulation, its supporters and breeders, as well as its critics and opponents.
Most humans, be they ordinary people or specialists and experts, seem to be unable to see things and the questions and problems of our time in a larger context, to grasp them in their entirety and to connect the most diverse facts and findings with each other in order to draw tangible conclusions and consequences. Nevertheless, more and more fields of expertise and specializations are emerging nowadays, whereby one specialist often cannot communicate with the other because they do not know anything beyond their subject and technical language and do not want to know anything else. This makes this knowledge practically inaccessible to people who are not familiar with the respective technical jargon. But what kind of knowledge is this, one wonders, if it cannot be shared with other people, or only with a few experts, due to its complexity and general incomprehensibility? If every expert or specialist idiot cultivates only his tiny area of knowledge competence and only knows about it within his limited scope, it is not surprising that in our highly specialized society there are droves of scientists, economists, ecologists, sociologists, politicians, consultants, philosophers and intellectuals who are unable to recognize that the root and main cause of all the evils of our time is overpopulation. How could they? If they are not even able to look beyond their own noses, there is much and loud-mouthed talk about all sorts of things, such as the redistribution of global wealth as a way to fight poverty and the moral obligation to give more money and aid to poor countries. There is also talk about the need for the industrialized countries to reduce polluting emissions in the context of global warming, and about the looming energy shortages and resource depletion, as well as about urgent political measures to stem the ever-increasing waves of immigration, which are already resembling a veritable migration of peoples. There is also a great deal of debate and growing concern among pacifists and religious humans about how to deal with the ethnic conflicts, wars, civil wars, dictatorships, etc., which are increasingly frequent and widespread and which plague our planet. But almost none the few exceptions confirm the rule of these debating people and the super-experts hiding behind their abstruse, euphemistic and diplomatic jargon seem to think that there is a common deep cause behind all these serious problems and phenomena, which is overpopulation. Instead of finally acknowledging this fact and working out appropriate solutions, most expert gurus and do-gooders even deny the fact that the Earth is overpopulated at all. They claim that there is enough space on Earth for many more billions of people, because there are still enough empty or underpopulated giant areas. In the ranks of the blinded population breeders, there are even those who think that the Earth could easily accommodate up to 30 or 40 billion, 30,000 or 40,000 humans, because in their opinion, technological progress or providence will one day automatically and finally eliminate all present shortages and hardships, such as environmental pollution and poverty, through new inventions and discoveries regarding renewable energy sources, food production, etc., so that there would then already be enough food and clean air for everyone. Furthermore, it is repeatedly claimed that the great mass of the Earth's people in and of themselves contribute incredibly little or nothing to the threatening environmental pollution and the greenhouse effect, because they are exclusively responsible for the obsolete and unclean industrial and production plants, power stations, and the massive car traffic, which is mainly in the developed countries. The overpopulation, or rather the current population level, has nothing to do with the increasingly frequent natural disasters such as earthquakes and seaquakes, floods, hurricanes, and heat waves, as such natural disasters have always occurred. Anyone who disagrees with this and persistently points to overpopulation as the root of all evil, in the sense that without its solution all other problems can also, or at least not effectively, be solved, is often branded a catastrophist or doomsayer, and not infrequently even goes so far as to accuse the advocates of global birth control and a temporary birth freeze of inhumanity, eugenics, and unauthorized interference in the private affairs of one's neighbor. But the question is, how can the advocates of ideologies be called humanists who, through toleration, open or disguised advocacy and promotion, as well as through the fine-tuning of overpopulation, that is to say of the unlimited, uncontrolled and degenerate growth of the world population, unscrupulously exposing hundreds of millions of people to starvation, misery, epidemics, wars and civil wars, and condemning them to live in hell in the name of false humanist theories and religious dogmas that are far removed from reality? On the other hand, it is also to be noted that many of those who are aware of the ever faster depletion of fossil fuel resources due to rapidly increasing exploitation and who speak in this context of a limit to economic growth are not willing and unwilling to accept that there are also natural limits to population growth. Since the Earth's arable surface on which people can produce their food is obviously not only limited, but is also diminishing as a result of growing overpopulation and, consequently, rapidly increasing urbanization. According to some studies, in the 20th century, the Earth's surface was not only diminishing in size, but also in its capacity to produce food. Century as much fertile ground areas were lost like within previous 1,000 years. It is also not the case, as some wishful thinkers and know-it-alls think, that the insane proliferation of human beings will eventually end naturally, that is to say through epidemics, famines and natural disasters, and that the population will return to normal quite spontaneously and take on environmentally compatible masses. In all the attacks, defamation and cover-up attempts against the few representatives of truly humane solutions to the grave evil of overpopulation, the Catholic Church and the Vatican play a particularly inglorious role. For, as is explained in detail in several recently published books, the Vatican has exerted and continues to exert a great, enigmatic and lobbying influence and pressure both on the commissions, bodies and agencies at the United Nations dealing with the issue of overpopulation and on governments and heads of state of many Catholic and Christian countries in Europe, Africa and America. In doing so, they block all efforts, oppose through their vetoes and allow everything to fail with regard to programs and plans of the international community, the UN or individual nations to curb overpopulation. It is therefore no coincidence that President Bush, who was helped to his fraudulent election victory by American Catholic groups and other Christian sects, shortly after taking office in 2000, enacted a law in return for which a worldwide education program for contraception, largely financed by the USA, had to be discontinued. The Catholic Church and other religions are secretly working meticulously to influence politicians in their favor, and threaten to stir up the population of Catholic and Christian countries against those in power, thereby jeopardizing the consensus if they take or plan undesirable birth control measures. In the past, at world summits and international conferences, as for instance at the Cairo Conference, the Vatican did not shrink from forming alliances with the otherwise hostile governments of Islamic states, and before that even with murderous dictatorships, as it was the case in the 1970s with the Chinese Mao regime when it was about imposing blockades with regard to possible birth control programs and the hypocritical population policy of Catholicism. Looking at modern history and the present, We can see, therefore, that overpopulation has been and continues to be advocated and cultivated for various reasons and on various political, ideological, and religious fronts and directions. Monarchs, dictators, despots, such as in the last century Hitler, Mussolini, Mao and Stalin, etc., were great and fanatical population breeders, because a growing population with many children served them and their politics for many purposes, such as the establishment and deployment of large armies to extend their power and sphere of influence through wars and conquests of other land areas and to exploit them. Then they were also concerned to have a large number of workers at their disposal who were to be used on a massive scale in the construction of railways, towns, settlements, colonies, and other works. The rabbit-like bred humans were and are still used in many places by unscrupulous rulers as weapons of war and conquest and as working machines. Even in today's overpopulated industrialized countries, such as in Europe, a decrease in population is feared as a disaster by politicians and economic bosses, and therefore secretly or even openly a birth-promoting policy is pursued, because people are regarded from a purely economic and materialistic point of view. That is to say, as a mass of passive consumers of goods and consumers with purchasing power and as tax and pension contributors. Because the more that is bought and consumed, the faster the economy and the market should grow, thereby increasing capital and profits. Since the time of the French Revolution, the conviction has been spread worldwide among farmers and the working class that for this reason many descendants must be produced in order to be able to recruit the necessary labor force from one's own family, which also spread the misconception that a large number of descendants is a good old age insurance. At the end of the 18th century, the philosopher Immanuel Kant advocated an ethic according to which man should always be an end in himself and never be used merely as a means to an end. A similar principle can be found in the teachings of the ancient prophets and sages and in modern times in Billy's spiritual teachings and in his many writings. But the ideologies by which overpopulation is bred contradict precisely this universal principle or law, for they used and abused people without exception as a means to their ends, no matter what they were. All the ideologies that have arisen in the course of modern history, some of which have fought against each other, have been based more or less on the absurd idea that the Earth's resources can be exploited infinitely and that, consequently, there is no limit to human and economic growth set by nature. But it is precisely this idea which, as a result of the demographic explosion, has clearly proved to be totally unrealistic, that is to say, unrealistic theory and ideology. It is an unpleasant characteristic and a habit of many people on our Earth to systematically throw to the wind every alarm and warning that is sounded in good time by responsible people who are sensible and intelligent, and even to cover it up with mockery and derision. This was and is the case with Billy Meyer and Phi Gu, as well as with others whose reports, articles, books, speeches, and prognoses on the overpopulation issue have either gone unnoticed or have been denied. This is particularly regrettable when one considers that many of them are about outstanding personalities who are recognized in their field, such as the ethnologist Konrad Lorenz,
the biologists Ernst Mayr,
Paul Ehrlich and Lynn Margulis, the science fiction writer and polymath Isaac Asimov, the writers and visionaries of the future Aldous Huxley and Daniel Quinn, the science journalist Hoymar von Dietfurt, the astronomers and physicists Fred Hoyle, Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, the ecologist James Lovelock, the political scientist Giovanni Sartori, and, last but not least, The engineer Aurelio Pezzei, who founded the research group Club of Rome in the early 1970s and in this context initiated and published an important series of studies and reports on the problem of overpopulation. The first and best known report of this group, published in 1972, was entitled The Limits to Growth and warned of possible dramatic future scenarios such as extreme shortages of raw materials and food, environmental degradation, global economic crisis, and finally, the collapse of the Earth, which, as a result of an inexorable and constant growth of the world population, would become very probable in the not-too-distant future, or, in the worst case, even come true. The conclusion, which highlights a number of causes and effects caused by overpopulation and closely linked to each other, can be summarized as follows. As the population grows, so does the demand for food and other material goods and commodities. If the demand for food grows, agricultural production must consequently also grow. As this grows, so does the use of fertilizers and pesticides, and as a result, the soil becomes increasingly leached and poorer, so that the erosion of fertile land increases. If the soil areas become more and more infertile, then agricultural production will also decrease, and as a result, the amount of food will also decrease. But if the amount of food decreases, the number of undernourished people and the number of starving people increases. If the demand for material goods and energy increases, then industrial production increases and consequently the extraction of raw materials, the consumption of water and fuel, etc. also increases, thus reducing the Earth's resources. However, as the Earth's resources decrease, wars and conflicts over these resources become more frequent. And finally, if industrial production grows, pollution increases accordingly, and if it continues to grow, people's lives and health will be severely damaged. Since then, it has become common practice among most scientists and experts to claim that the reports on forecasts produced by this composite research group have proven to be completely false, and they try to discredit its members as errant Cassandrasians and as enemies of progress and economics, and to go down in the annals of history as such. It would appear that the warning cry contained in this controversial study report was a stumbling block to the scientific community and politics. But just how reckless and unreasonable the arguments of all those who reject the thesis of the overpopulation fighters and overpopulation warners were and are, without giving them enough thought or simply because of their learned prejudices and false assumptions, can be read very well in the example of the following reactions to the above-mentioned report on the limits of growth. Firstly, the economic representatives reacted with indignation, because they assumed that a reduction in population would seriously affect economic growth and that, as a result, there would be stagnation and standstill in terms of the production of goods and technological development. The fact that the relatively sparsely populated Scandinavian countries have the highest per capita incomes, flourishing economies, and well-functioning welfare institutions was of course not taken into account. It was also assumed that a limitation or reduction of growth on the part of the West would be to the advantage of the countries of the Eastern Bloc. That is why the authors of the report were described as dangerous revolutionaries and traitors to the West. It was also argued that progress in technical inventions and the invisible and providential hand of the economic market and its natural laws would in future solve any problem of resource scarcity, and that there was therefore no reason at all to worry about population growth. Then loud voices were raised in the Catholic Church, too, which voiced harsh criticism of the report, because from their point of view every generation of descendants no matter to what extent, as well as all life, according to Christian doctrine, is a gift and work of God and His providence. And that is why people have no right to intervene in the divine plans in order to regulate or reduce the proliferation of human beings, for the Bible clearly says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." However, strong objections and contradictions were also heard among the leftists and the 68, which amounted to showing that the ideas represented in this study would lead to underpinning the privileges and supremacy of the capitalists and the ruling class, because by reducing growth, poverty and social differences would be further aggravated. The reactions at the government level were no different, because in the Eastern Bloc countries it was believed that the future disasters warned of in the report only applied to the capitalist states, because the greater organizational capacity of socialist systems made it possible to regulate the relationship between the production of goods and population growth through centralized planned economies and state power, so that environmental destruction would not occur. But the fact that the opposite was true in those very countries, and that the worst ecological disasters occurred there during the Soviet era, became obvious in the following years and especially after the fall of the wall. It is clear from these examples that every party, every social group and stratum, every country and every government has shifted and shifted the responsibility for reducing population growth onto others, the North onto the South, the East onto the West, and vice versa, so that in the end everyone washes their hands of it and believes that this extensive plague on Earth always affects others and not themselves, and that the task of counteracting it is therefore only up to others. Things are similar today, although the Cold War is over and so-called globalization has exacerbated all problems of overpopulation through mass emigration and the Asian economic boom. But among the opponents of globalization, there is no willingness and ability to see reality as it really is in order to get to the bottom of all the evils of the earth, but they only want to fight them according to their external symptoms and not according to the true deep cause. On the other hand, in the eyes of the real reality observers and reality researchers, the close connection between strong population growth on the one hand and wars, conflicts,
terror,
anarchy, massacres, genocides and revolutions, etc., within individual countries and on a global scale, on the other hand, is becoming increasingly obvious, which of course does not mean that overpopulation is the sole cause of wars, etc. As is also clearly evident from the research results of the German genocide researcher and demograph Gunnar Heinzson. On the basis of many years of historical and current analyses and comparisons, he has come to the conclusion that in countries where there is a youth surplus or a surplus of young people in the population, there is a need for a new approach. There is a strong increase in the young male population, so that children and adolescents between 0 and 25 years of age make up about 30% of the total population. The outbreak of ethnic conflicts, wars, civil terrorism and genocides is much more frequent and considerably more likely than in societies and countries where the proportion of the older population is much larger in comparison, because when a country brings into the world a large and growing mass of young men who, mainly due to their superior numbers and the resulting overpopulation of their country, live in a state of joblessness and lack of prospects and social impoverishment, they feel increasingly frustrated and dissatisfied, which is why aggression and outbreaks of violence of all kinds are pre-programmed. There are also scientists who have drawn their attention to further connections in relation to the negative effects of overpopulation, such as the well-known animal behavior researcher Konrad Lorenz, who in his book The 8 Deadly Sins of Civilized Mankind has investigated the connection between overpopulation, human emotional impoverishment, coolness, and general loneliness and anonymity, especially of city dwellers. According to his knowledge, the exaggerated and unnatural accumulation of people in a certain habitat increases the potential for aggression and leads to the fact that one must increasingly protect oneself from one's neighbor because he is perceived as a potential danger and threat, so that one tends to withdraw more and more into one's own private sphere and to avoid interpersonal relationships beyond one's own circle of family and friends as far as possible. Lawrence was of the opinion that these deadly sins or main evils of our civilization are rooted in overpopulation and must therefore not be considered separately, but in their totality and interaction, because they are all interrelated. The major evils of our time, as he mentioned, are therefore the following. 1. Overpopulation. 2. Destruction of the inner and outer natural habitat. 3. Fierce competition between the humans, making them blind and indifferent to the true inner values. 4. Emotional impoverishment and generalized effeminacy of the humans. 5. Decay of the genetic makeup. 6. Disappearance of traditions and emergence of conflicts and separation between generations. 7. Increasing willingness of people to indoctrinate, brainwash, and patronize through political ideological propaganda as well as through advertising and media influence. 8. Nuclear arms race. In the face of the immense reality of overpopulation, biologist Ernst Mayr also pointed out that terrestrial mankind should develop a new environmental ethic. That is to say, an environmentally compatible way of dealing with the planet Earth, which places the emphasis on preventing and averting its pathological tendency to proliferate and takes into account the fact that overpopulation is the greatest danger and that reducing it is consequently the greatest challenge for the human race. He even went so far as to claim, rightly, that the work of those philosophers and religionists who encourage and call upon women to bear as many children as possible is tantamount to a crime against humanity, and shows that such individuals are devoid of any truly human ethics or humanity, because the latter should enable man to transfer the consequences of his actions and decisions to the whole of humanity and to the earth. Since overpopulation causes death and misery on several occasions, he believes that all those who advocate it should be held responsible for the death and misery to which countless people fall victim through it. These are truly very brave and realistic words. In connection with the countless evil effects of the demographic time bomb, which is ticking away ever faster, there is also the further fact that there is a direct and indirect relationship between population growth and the greenhouse effect in the form of excessive carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere by the insane majority of the Earth's humans and the corresponding human works, activities and means of transport. Through the work of scientists Norman D. Newell and Leslie Marcus, who analyzed the period from 1958 to 1983, it was possible to prove that the constant increase in carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere runs exactly parallel to the growth of the world's population. They even claimed that the two factors are so closely interrelated that it is possible to calculate the world population level fairly accurately by measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. From Pleiadian sources, it is now also known that even the simple breathing of several billion Earth humans and countless domestic animals contributes significantly to the greenhouse effect. A further tendency with regard to the overpopulation question, which can be clearly seen on close observation, is that if overpopulation is admitted to the Earth, it is usually only applied to the Third World and developing countries because the Western countries suffered from a severe population decline. However, the fact that countries such as Italy, Germany, Japan as well as Europe as a whole and the USA are extremely overpopulated is usually not taken into account because the natural population limit of a country is not calculated on the basis of its total fertile land area and the fact that 1 square kilometer of a fertile land can feed a maximum of 12 people in abundance. This should be a simple concept, because just as every ship has a certain carrying capacity which must not be exceeded because it will sink, so the ship Earth has a human carrying capacity limit which, because of its limited total fertile land surface, must not be exceeded if we do not want to ruin it. In conclusion, it must also be said that it cannot be ruled out that the urge for uncontrolled and unnatural reproduction of the human race has become so deeply ingrained in the collective subconscious as well as in the individual subconscious forms of many people as a learned, instinctive and genetically transferable pattern of behavior that they no longer even become aware of this disturbed reproduction program, because it is automatically activated again and again as if it corresponded to a healthy, species-preserving instinct. However, this should not hide the fact that every human being is a self-conscious being who, as such, has the opportunity to think about his instinctive drives, to become aware of them and to control them.
Andrea Berticcioli, Italy.